Welcome to our group meeting for container security. The first one today I wanted to walk through is the epic to allow the security policy project to be unlinked. This was an issue. I promoted it to an epic just because it has backend and front-end work. I felt like it would be easier to organize it that way. It should be pretty small and pretty straightforward, I'm hoping. And I don't think we have the designs in the epic just yet, but they are pretty much done in the link design issue.
Why is there backend work?
I thought there was backend work. If there's not, that's great too.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong in that.
I'm pretty sure that there is. I don't think we have backend logic right now to unlink a policy management project.
I thought there was some backend work. I don't think it's big, but I think there's some.
Okay.
Basically, this introduces a new trash can delete icon here. And if you click it, you get this message saying unlinking the project. We'll have to run this text past tech writing, but basically saying the project won't have any policies at all. So if you hit save, actually, that's not technically true because it might have some network policies. So we'll have to wordsmith that error message, but you get an error message just telling you exactly what's about to happen. And then if you hit save, then the project's removed and you're back to that initial state. Are there any questions about that, or are we ready to move that to refinement?
It is a little bit tricky having to work with policies being stored in two different places at once.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can consolidate those at some point in the not too distant future. We'll see what resourcing looks like going forward for our team, but I'm hoping that we can start to allocate a little bit more work on container host and container network security so that we can actually move those into the security policy project. Yeah, good question for note. Yeah, until then, we're just gonna have to kind of work around having the policies stored in two locations. But again, I'm hoping that's a temporary thing, not a permanent thing. Any other concerns? Thumbs up. Are we good to move this to refinement? Okay. So the next one I wanted to cover was this thread I've been having with Brian. It's an MR. Apologize if it's been holding up the MR. I hope it hasn't held it up too long. Long story short is we did not really consider, or at least I didn't fully think through where vulnerabilities would need to be fixed and how they would need to be fixed when we designed the cluster image scanning. As Brian pointed out, you actually need to not only update the image, but even once you update the image, it's not automatically pulled into a new deployment. So you also have to restart the deployment. So it makes more sense to have the vulnerabilities tied to the deployment rather than the image. Even though we're scanning the image, it's possible that the image is updated, and that affects some deployments, but then other deployments are using an outdated image. And so it just makes sense to have them associated a little bit more correctly. Of course, the challenge with that, and my concern with associating it with a unique fingerprint for the deployment, is if you've got a really large Kubernetes cluster and you've got 100 deployments using the same image, now you're going to have that same vulnerability listed 100 times in the vulnerability report. And that's going to just be a lot of noise, and it's going to make it really hard to go through that vulnerability report. So I don't have a ton of great ideas here, but I'm hopeful that we can brainstorm and find a way to kind of get the best of both worlds. Basically, what I'm suggesting is we've got this upcoming epic in general for the container scanning analyzer. And right now we actually duplicate for the same CVE, we duplicate the vulnerabilities for each package that it exists in. And this actually is a little bit redundant for several reasons. One of which most of the time, in fact, I'm wondering if it's all the time, but at least the vast majority of the time, one of these packages is really just including or requiring another package. And so the vulnerability propagates itself through several packages, and you really just need to update the underlying package, and that takes care of the vulnerability in all of the packages. So the proposal here is to consolidate this or group it by showing it as just one item on the vulnerability report. But then when we list out the packages, we just comma delimitate, use a comma delimitator to separate them out and say, you know, this CVE applies to both of these packages. And if you were to fix it in just one package and not the other, which again, I'm not even sure if that's possible, but if you did fix it in one package and not the other, then this list would just get smaller and you would still have the CVE showing up in your list. I'm wondering if we need to consider some sort of UX design that does the same thing for cluster image scanning, where it actually show up as one line item. And then somewhere in there, we would list out all of the different deployments that are affected. And I'm not sure what that does from a vulnerability fingerprinting perspective. I think that may actually point to fingerprinting it based on the image, not the deployment. But anyway, I'm not sure on the technical details there. But from a UX perspective, I'm thinking maybe we do something like this just to keep it manageable for those larger clusters.
Yeah, so I do like the idea of like grouping the vulnerabilities together. I also think that's kind of something that we'll have to do, something that we should do for every type of vulnerability, not just container scanning or cluster image scanning. Like even fast, you could have, you know, the same vulnerability in multiple different files, right? So we probably want to introduce like a new type of fingerprint where we can like uniquely identify a vulnerability, and that vulnerability can exist in multiple locations. And what we can do is, you know, when you go to the vulnerability details page, you can see all the different locations where that vulnerability exists. So we'd probably introduce like a new type of fingerprint, like a vulnerability fingerprint or something. And then we can group all of the vulnerabilities together to have the same fingerprint.
Yeah, Alan, you might know more about this, but I know that there actually is something in the back end for findings versus vulnerabilities, and I do not fully understand the difference between those two. Is that the same thing that we're talking about here?
It is similar. Right now in Threat Insights, they're changing from one system to another. So it's still in the progress. I'm not sure if we can use that or if we need to come up with some new idea. I'll have to take a look. Definitely a spike would be useful here because we need to understand what's going on in Threat Insights and if we can use it or not. So we just need to start with spike and try to find the best idea here.
Yeah, I don't really understand the findings yet, but I think like I talked with Tiago about it a little bit, and he told me that, you know, the reason we have findings is because there might be multiple findings associated with one vulnerability. But today, there's only ever one finding for a single vulnerability, I believe. I saw that in a comment somewhere in the code. It might not be true.
That is true. Like 2 years ago, I believe there was a transition to new security dashboard. And before that, we were showing only those findings, which back then was like vulnerability occurrences. And then we've introduced vulnerabilities, but what it is right now, it's actually essentially a copy of like finding. And in the future, the goal is to have one vulnerability and multiple findings. So that would be useful for us because we're going to have this one vulnerability with one CVE and then multiple occurrences of that vulnerability. As for now, it's not supported yet, and I'm not sure what's the plan and when it will be supported to have multiple findings for each vulnerability. But that's interesting. Definitely, we can come back to that with Threat Insight, with Mehmet, for example.
Yeah, that sounds like exactly what we need, right? It's one CVE that exists in multiple locations. And actually for cluster image scanning, it just compounds the problem because it could be not only multiple deployments, but also multiple packages within each deployment. So for container scanning, we're talking about rolling up the packages, but we actually need to roll up packages and deployments for cluster image scanning, potentially. Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Let's move forward with that, creating a spike. You know, Brian, I don't want it to hold up your MR. The feature is in alpha state anyway, so if we need to make changes to the way we do the fingerprinting in the future, we can. But yeah, I'll create a new spike issue so that we can look into that and see if there's a better way we can handle that, or if we need to go contribute to the Threat Insights work.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. I'm glad we got to bubble up the discussion about that.
All right, anything else on that topic?
I'm ready to move on to the next item.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure I shared some information with the team about the new workspace object. Some of you know more about this, perhaps some of you know less. I think you know Alan was pulled away to go work on security vulnerabilities for a little while on the manage import team. There's actually been other individuals pulled from other teams to go assist in other areas as well. One of those is the Workspace Group. So the Workspace Group is a new group in GitLab. It's a new team, and they're actually getting a whole lot of help too from other engineers across the company at the moment to help accelerate their work. And I'm still learning about what they're doing. So take this with, you know, a grain of salt that I don't have perfect information here, but I'll share the latest and greatest of what I know. Essentially, we have the instance object, and that's actually tied to the hardware that runs GitLab. And today we have a lot of settings that are at that instance level that actually don't really belong there because they're not tied to the hardware. And we've just put them there because it's the only place that we could put them to have it apply to an entire organization, if you will, a namespace in GitLab, right? So especially thinking about GitLab SaaS, you know, we've got a lot of different companies and organizations there. They each need to manage settings, not on a group level, but on an organizational level. And so that's really where this workspace object is coming in. It's a new object that, you know, we're going to leave the hardware things there tied to the instance. And then anything that's not tied to the actual physical hardware, we're going to separate that out so that users can manage things at an organizational level for all of their groups. Part of that effort as well is consolidating the number of objects that we have inside of GitLab, and they're going about this in an iterative way. So right now, if you want to build something, you have to implement it at the project level, and then you have to implement it for groups, and actually subgroups are another object in GitLab. And then you have the instance, and anyway, there are like a lot of different areas, and you have to implement it differently for each object. And it's just a little bit of a mess because you can't even just copy paste your code. So the implementation that we've done for security policies at the project level, you can't just copy paste that over to group without things breaking. So again, it's a little bit of a mess right now. We have a lot of different objects out there. So part of this is as they create this new object, they have a new shared object that gets inherited or extended. I think extended would be the correct term. So project object will now extend this new workspace object, and the group object will extend the workspace object. So you still are going to have some things that are specific to projects and groups because they're trying to do it iteratively. but there's now a shared object where you can put shared code in that will apply to everything. So you can build it once and have it available for groups, projects, and at the Uber workspace level, if that makes sense. So that's where they're starting, is just by making that Uber object. Apparently it's targeted to be done by the end of 14.5. That should be ready for us to start contributing things into that shared object code. So it's the same code for all of the different things out there. So that's a lot of information. What questions do you have? Looks like there's a few.
Yes, I have quite a few questions. So the way you're describing it, it sounds like it's basically it basically consists of multiple groups. So is this going to exist on SaaS or only self-hosted?
Both. In fact, that's the whole idea, is that on SaaS, it's going to allow each SaaS customer or organization to access some settings that previously were not accessible to them because it was on the admin panel tied to the hardware unnecessarily, right? So it's basically saying this setting here there's no reason for it to be hardware specific. It really should be unique for each customer.
Right. It's only like the operational administrators of the GitLab instance have access to the admin. So if you want to have settings across multiple groups, you need to surface those somewhere else where non-operational people can configure them.
Right. It's going to give us much better feature parity between self-managed and SaaS because, again, anything that was tied to the instance before was not accessible to SaaS users. So we had to lock all of that away. And now by separating it out, we can make that available.
Do you know why they picked the name Workspace?
I don't, and I think they're actually discussing the name now. I don't know where the thread is for that, but if you can find it, you can weigh in on that. They have actually a number of different names. Namespace is being used in the back end, so you might see namespace in the back end code. Then customer facing, we're calling it Workspace, and then organization is another name. So I think that's an ongoing discussion right now. You might have an opportunity to contribute to that.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up because I think I have a much better idea of what Workspace is now.
All right, so with all that information, again, this is mostly just informational, but because the soonest that they'll be ready is the end of 14.5, at least the backend work for all of this, we probably don't want to start until 14.6 because otherwise we're going to be implementing this at the group level, and that'll be more or less throwaway code because we'll have to then re-implement it at the whatever they call it, namespace or workspace level. So in any case, I'm not going to change it in the priority order, but we should just skip that one and go on to the next priority in the list until, if we need to. Maybe we won't get there by 14.6, but if we need to keep going, we'll just skip that and then come back to this in 14.6 if needed.
Yeah, I don't really see a technical reason why we couldn't start working on the group already, but we got plenty of stuff to do in the meantime.
So the reason would be just avoiding re-implementation, because if you do it in this new object, it's a shared object, and so that's going to give it to you at the group level for free. And actually it would replace our current project level implementation. So that would be the only reason. Like, yeah, we could go do it at the group, but it's kind of throwaway code because what we really want is to have it implemented at the workspace level, and that'll give it to us at all three levels. All right, we've reached the end of our agenda. Are there any other items to discuss today? All right, well, thanks everyone. Have a great week.